Why do we so quickly categorize people into us and them? It's a tendency that feels almost automatic, doesn't it? And it shapes our societies and our personal interactions in these really profound ways. But here's the thing, this isn't random. It's actually a fundamental part of our psychology, and social science has some pretty powerful explanations for why it all happens. I mean, really, just stop and think about it for a second. The moment you meet someone, your brain just starts filing them away based on all these different signals. So where does that impulse even come from, and what purpose does it serve? All right, so let's dive in. To really get to the heart of this us versus them mentality, we're going to look at it through three different lenses that social psychologists use: the economic, the motivational, and the cognitive. You can think of each one as a different piece of the puzzle. But first things first. To make sure we're all on the same page, we need to be really precise with our language. See, in social psychology, the components of bias are broken down into three totally distinct ideas: what we believe, what we feel, and what we do. So, it all starts with a stereotype. This is the cognitive part, the belief. It's basically a mental schema, or a shortcut, like thinking a certain group of people are all athletic, or good at math, or, well, anything else. It's a generalization. Then you have prejudice. Now, this is the feeling, the emotional component. It's the attitude you attach to that stereotype. And it can be positive or negative: admiration, envy, fear, or dislike. But the key is that it's rooted in emotion, not just a neutral belief. And finally, that brings us to discrimination. This is the action, the behavioral part. It's when those beliefs and those feelings actually lead to unfair treatment. So, just to recap, a stereotype is the thought, prejudice is the feeling, and discrimination is the behavior. Got it? Okay, with that clear, let's look at our first driver. So, the economic perspective argues that a lot of hostility between groups comes from a really simple place: competition. When different groups are all fighting over the same limited resources, tension is, well, almost inevitable. This idea is called realistic group conflict theory, and those limited resources don't just mean money or land. It could be anything: jobs, political power, even social status. The minute one group's gain is seen as another group's loss, conflict is pretty much bound to pop up. What's really fascinating is just how easily this kind of conflict can be created out of thin air. One of the most famous studies in all of psychology, the Robbers Cave experiment, demonstrated this perfectly. Researchers took a totally normal group of 11-year-old boys at a summer camp and basically turned them into warring tribes. Let's see how they did it. So first, they created two separate groups, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and just let them bond and build their own group spirit. Then they introduced the competition phase, a week-long tournament where the winners got awesome prizes and the losers got nothing. And the result? Instant conflict. The groups became incredibly hostile, raiding each other's cabins and hurling insults. And hey, this wasn't just some friendly rivalry. The researchers observed genuine, deep-seated animosity. The boys were using words like bums, cowards, and stinkers to describe their rivals. They even burned each other's flags. And remember, these were just normal kids a week earlier. So how on earth did the researchers fix it? Well, they introduced what they called superordinate goals. They basically manufactured problems like a breakdown of the camp's water supply or a supply truck getting stuck. These were problems that neither group could possibly solve alone. And this brilliantly shows the solution. It was only by working together toward a shared goal that the hostility finally dissolved. But competition for stuff isn't the whole story, not even close. The second driver is motivational. It suggests that a big part of our us versus them thinking is driven by this deep psychological need to feel good about ourselves and, by extension, the groups we belong to. This is the core idea behind social identity theory. It says that your self-concept isn't just about you as an individual. A huge chunk of your self-esteem comes from the status of your groups, your nationality, your favorite sports team, your college. When your group wins, you feel like a winner too. Okay, this was demonstrated in what's called the minimal group paradigm. It's wild. Researchers assigned people to groups based on totally arbitrary things, like a coin toss. Then they were asked to award points to members of their own group, the in-group, and the other group. Now, you might think people would choose that last option, to give their own team the most points, right? 21. But they don't. They consistently choose an option like the first one, giving 18 to their group and only 3 to the other.
The key insight here is incredible. It's not about getting the most for us. It's about creating the biggest possible gap between us and them.
And this tendency, it gets even stronger when our self-esteem is threatened. In one study, participants got either positive or negative feedback on an intelligence test. Afterwards, they had to evaluate a job candidate. The results are pretty striking. The people who received negative feedback, the ones whose egos were a little bruised, rated the Jewish candidate significantly more negatively.
But here's the real kicker. Why? This next chart reveals the motivation. For the participants who got that negative feedback, putting down the Jewish candidate actually gave their own self-esteem the biggest boost. It was a way for them to repair their bruised ego. This just powerfully shows that sometimes denigrating an outgroup can be a psychological tool we use to feel better about ourselves.
Okay, so we have competition and we have motivation. The third and final perspective is cognitive. It basically argues that stereotyping is a natural, if sometimes deeply flawed byproduct of how our brains are wired. We're built to process an overwhelming amount of information, and to do that, our brains just love shortcuts. Stereotypes are, in essence, mental shortcuts or schemas that help our brains process information way more efficiently. One study shows this perfectly. Participants were given info about a person, but one group was also given a stereotype they could apply. Well, that group later performed better on a completely separate memory test, in this case about Indonesian geography. And why? Because using the stereotype as a shortcut freed up mental energy, which they could then use for the other task. So these shortcuts make our brains more efficient. That sounds like a benefit, right? A feature, not a bug. But what is the real human cost of relying on these automatic categorizations? And this is where it gets incredibly serious. A famous study on shooter bias had participants play a video game where they had to make a split-second decision whether to shoot armed targets. The results are just sobering. Participants, and this is key, both black and white participants, made more mistakes when the target was black. Specifically, they were far more likely to mistakenly shoot an unarmed black person than an unarmed white person. It's a powerful and frankly devastating demonstration of how a simple cognitive shortcut, an automatic stereotype, can have literal life or death consequences. So, here we are. We have these three powerful forces: competition, motivation, and cognition, all driving bias. Given how deeply ingrained these processes are in our psychology, what can we actually do to reduce prejudice and discrimination? Well, research does point to a few approaches. Two major ideologies that often come up are colorblindness and multiculturalism. Now, the colorblind approach suggests we should just ignore group differences. But research actually shows this can backfire and lead to more prejudice because it ignores the unique challenges different groups face. The multicultural approach, on the other hand, which acknowledges and values group differences, has been found to be more effective. It seems to reduce anxiety in interracial interactions and is generally preferred by members of marginalized groups. And that really brings us to our final big question. We've seen that bias isn't just some simple character flaw. It's fueled by real competition for resources, our deep human need for self-esteem, and our brain's basic wiring for efficiency. So the real challenge isn't just about changing individual minds, but thinking how can we design our schools, our workplaces, and our communities to counteract these powerful fundamental human forces.